Welcome to our discussion on bone tissue. First, we're going to examine bone anatomy and cells. So we're going to examine both the gross and microscopic anatomy of bone. Our objectives in this first portion are to identify the tissues and organs of the skeletal system and discuss the gross anatomy and histology of osseous tissue. Bone as a tissue is a type of connective tissue. All connective tissue has a matrix. This matrix is hardened in bone by minerals, specifically calcium phosphate. Individual bones consist of bone tissue, bone marrow, blood, cartilage, and periosteum. Bone continually remodels itself. It's always adapting to the stresses that we place on it. So the functions of the skeletal system are going to be to support the body. Without our skeleton, we would be big blobs on the floor. The skeletal system also protects us. It protects our heart and lungs with the rib cage and protects our brain with the cranium. The skeletal system is essential for movement. Our muscles need levers to act upon, and the skeletal system provides these levers. Mineral homeostasis is another function of the skeletal system. The skeleton stores electrolytes, mainly calcium, and it stores phosphate, which is a buffer that helps with acid-base balance. The bone marrow inside of the skeletal system deals with both red blood cell and white blood cell formation. That's where we create those blood cells. The skeletal system in adults also stores fat in the marrow cavity of the bone. And finally, the skeletal system produces a hormone called osteocalcin. This hormone is thought to have to do with insulin sensitivity and signaling. This is a fairly new hormone, and they're still examining the full role of this hormone in both bone and other tissue. Bones can be named based on their shape. Long bones are going to be longer than they are wide, and these are generally levers that are acted upon by muscles. Some examples of these are the humerus, femur, ulna, radius, tibia, and fibula. Short bones glide across each other in multiple directions. Our carpals and tarsals contain a lot of short bones. One example of a short bone is the talus, which is the bone that the tibia sits on top of in the ankle. Flat bones function to protect soft organs. The sternum is a flat bone, the ribs are flat bones, and the cranium contains flat bones. Finally, we have irregular bones. Irregular bones are very odd shapes. So the vertebral bones, the bones in the vertebral column, are very odd in shape, and they're very specific to their function. So they have a hole in the middle that the spinal cord goes through, and then they have a bunch of processes which stick out and allow for many muscles to attach to each vertebra. This is an irregular shape. Some general features of bones, more specifically long bones. Long bones contain a shaft or diaphysis, which is a cylinder of compact bone. That cylinder of compact bone contains a marrow cavity, sometimes also called a medullary cavity, and that cavity is lined on the inside with endosteum. So if we're looking at the marrow cavity, the next layer is going to be reticular connective tissue, and then just beyond that, there's going to be osteogenic cells, and then beyond that, you will run into the cylinder of compact bone. So endosteum includes the osteogenic cells that are right on the compact bone, and the reticular connective tissue that covers them up. The shaft of the bone, the diaphysis of the bone, is also covered with periosteum. So this is on the outside of the bone. There's a fibrous layer of collagen that's on the outside, and then just underneath it, right next to the compact bone, we have an inner layer of osteogenic cells. These osteogenic cells can develop into osteoblasts when the bone needs to be remodeled and built to be stronger. The periosteum is like a shrink wrap on the outside. The endosteum is like a shrink wrap on the inside. The enlarged ends of the bones are called epiphyses. These are spongy bone covered with a thin layer of compact bone, and they are enlarged to strengthen the joint and provide a location for ligaments to attach. We also have the part of the bone that becomes the joint surface, and that joint surface is covered with articular cartilage. This is a form of hyaline cartilage. The epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate, is the junction between the diaphysis and the epiphyses, and this is where long bones grow in length. You can see on this picture we have a layer of compact bone in the diaphysis, the shaft of the bone, and that cylinder of compact bone goes all the way around. So it's kind of like a paper towel tube. This diaphysis, this cylinder, is made up of compact bone. Inside of the epiphyses and at the ends of the diaphysis, we have spongy bone. So lots of spongy bone in there. We have the marrow cavity, this middle cavity, which in this case is filled with a yellow fatty marrow. So in adults, our long bones are filled mainly with a fatty yellow marrow, which allows bone to store fat. We also have the articular cartilage. So that's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage that caps both ends of the bone. So you can see the distal articular cartilage right here. And this is on bones where bones meet bone to bone, and it helps to provide shock absorption and a smooth surface for those bones to move across. Then the last structure I'd like to point out on this diagram is the periosteum. And you can see the periosteum has been peeled back right here, and it's like a shrink wrap on the bone. So it's a connective tissue that has a layer of osteogenic cells just right under the surface. So the osteogenic cells are going to be right in between that connective tissue layer and the compact bone. A flat bone is arranged a little bit differently. There are some important features of a flat bone, and those include the external and internal surfaces. So that would be the external surface and the internal surface. Those are both going to be made of compact bone. Then in the middle layer, we see spongy bone. So it's like a bone sandwich. We've got spongy bone in the middle and compact bone on either side. One thing that can happen if you get a skull fracture is you can break this outer layer of bone, but this inner layer of bone can stay intact. That's a much less serious fracture than if you fracture both layers of bone. One thing to note is the trabeculae, or delicate struts, that form spongy bone. So these are all trabeculae. And this forms the spongy structure of spongy bone. So we can see that micrograph showing us the microscopic structure of spongy bone. The cells of osseous tissue function to build and remodel bone throughout our lifetime. Osteogenic cells are in the endosteum, the periosteum, or the central canals, and they can develop into new osteoblasts. These arise from embryonic fibroblasts and multiply continuously. These are a form of stem cell. So these stem cells are around and multiplying and will produce osteoblasts as needed. Osteoblasts function to mineralize the organic matter of the matrix. So first we produce collagen, and which is the organic matter of matrix, and then we lay down minerals on top of it to make it hard. So osteoblasts produce an enzyme that binds calcium and increases the local calcium concentration. This allows calcium to mineralize or crystallize on top of the organic collagen. This enzyme is called alkaline phosphatase, so it helps with the mineralization process, and osteoblasts are what produce that enzyme. Once osteoblasts have built the bone around them, they become osteocytes. You can remember this because the osteocyte is always at the same site. It doesn't move around. So they're trapped in the matrix, and these cells in lacunae are connected by gap junctions inside canaliculi. So these osteocytes have cellular processes, like this one, that sits inside of one of those little tiny canals, a canaliculi, and it will be in contact with another osteocyte. And those two osteocytes are connected by gap junctions. This becomes important in sensing stress and communicating between cells. Our fourth and last cell of osseous tissue is the osteoclast. This is a bone resorbing cell, and these develop in bone marrow by the fusion of 3 to 50 stem cells. Specifically, these stem cells come from a white blood cell called a monocyte. So this is a fairly large white blood cell, and they fuse together to form these large osteoclasts. Once these osteoclasts are formed, they use their ruffled border, which is this border right here, to eat pits into the bone. So they basically make themselves a little home. They burrow into the bone, and then they can reabsorb bone as needed. So some of the histology or microscopic structure of compact bone. We have the compact bone that surrounds, this happens to be the head of the femur. So we've got a thin layer of compact bone. We also have a layer of compact bone that lines the edge of the pelvis. And then we have spongy bone inside of that. So from lab, we're familiar with the rings of the osteon, the lamellae. Each of those are the rings. And we have a central canal that's in the middle of those rings. And then we have lacunae, or little lakes, where the osteocytes reside. So here's a micrograph with our central canal, our osteon, that whole structure, and inside of the osteon there's layers or lamellae, and then we also have osteocytes that are located inside of lacuna. With spongy bone, you can see in this top picture that we have trabeculae, so these are the delicate struts of bone we were looking at earlier, and in between those trabeculae we have bone marrow. So bone marrow is very important for blood cell formation, and it allows the blood to be in very close contact with the osteocytes that are in the trabeculae. The matrix of bone or osseous tissue is about 1/3 organic matter, or collagen, and 2/3 inorganic matter, forms of calcium and phosphate. Organic matter includes collagen, glycosaminoglycans, proteoglycans, and glycoproteins. The last 3 items are all combinations of carbohydrates and proteins, and they tend to be very good at holding water and cushioning things. So they help to connect everything together. And then collagen you're very familiar with because we've looked at it in lab. The inorganic matter of bone is 85% hydroxyapatite, and that's mainly calcium. It's 10 atoms of calcium and then a little bit of phosphate, so lots of calcium in there. And then it's about 10% calcium carbonate. And then we have some other minerals, including fluoride, potassium, and magnesium. This combination of organic and inorganic matter provides for both strength and resilience. Resilience is the ability to deform and then return to the original shape. So the minerals in bone resist compression, so being squished, whereas the collagen resists being stretched or broken. And bone can adapt by varying the proportions of minerals and collagen. In compact bone, the osteon is the basic structural unit. This basically looks like a big tree trunk. We have cylinders formed from layers, we call those layers lamellae, of matrix around a central canal, so an osteonic canal or a central canal. These collagen fibers alternate between right and left-handed helices, so they twirl around the osteon in opposite directions so that we get strength whether we twist clockwise or counterclockwise. Osteocytes are the cells in the osteon in compact bone, and they're connected to each other and their blood supply by teeny processes in canaliculi, which are very small canals. We also have perforating canals or Volkmann canals. These are vascular canals, that means they have arteries and veins in them, and they perpendicularly join central canals. Let's take a look at this. Here is an osteon, and within that osteon you can see the different layers or lamellae. So there's one layer, here's another layer. And you can see the central canal that has a artery, a vein, and a nerve in that central canal. So if you follow the central canal down, you can see a perforating canal. So perforating canals are generally on the transverse plane and will connect central canals to each other. Spongy bone is named because of the sponge-like appearance formed by plates of bone called trabeculae. The spaces between these plates of bone are filled with red bone marrow. Trabeculae have very few osteons or central canals because all of the cells, all of the osteocytes, are very close to the blood that's contained in the bone marrow. The advantage of spongy bone is that it provides strength with very little weight. The trabeculae will develop along the bone's lines of stress, so we get more thicker spongy bone in areas where there's stress. We can see this if we look at the head of the femur. Our body weight comes straight down on the femur, but the femur isn't directly underneath us. It's either on the right or on the left. So as the stress is transferred to the head of the femur and then down the femur, we see an area where there's compression on the inside of the bone and an area where there's tension on the outside of the bone. So we have stresses in both places. There's a magical balancing point right in the middle that's the point of no stress. If we take a look at a cross-section of a bone, we see that point of no stress has no spongy bone. It's an empty area. However, along the lines of stress, we see more spongy bone has been formed. So we have spongy bone over here, spongy bone over here, as well as a line of spongy bone along this line of stress. So the bone will actually remodel depending on the stresses placed upon it. Bone marrow is found in the medullary cavities of long bones and among the trabeculae in spongy bone. Red bone marrow is like thick blood, and it includes reticular fibers and immature cells. Bone marrow is hemopoietic. It produces blood cells, so both red and white blood cells. In the adult, we find bone marrow in the axial skeleton. That includes the vertebra, ribs, sternum, and in addition, we find it in the pelvic girdle and the proximal heads of the femur and the humerus. In children, even more of their bones contain red bone marrow. They're producing lots of blood cells to keep up with growth, and therefore most of their long bones will still have red bone marrow in them. As we become adults, that red bone marrow that's in the shaft or diaphysis of long bones is replaced by a yellow marrow. This yellow marrow is fatty marrow, and it's found in the long bones of adults. Finally, as we get older, that marrow continues to adapt and change, and it becomes a gelatinous marrow of old age. So the yellow marrow is replaced with a reddish jelly. And that completes our discussion of the basics of bone structure. We'll now move on to how bone is formed.